So thank you all for coming. We'll just wait for our speakers to get up on stage. Here they are.
Order here. Well, he's first. I heard I'm second. Hi, Bob. I'm pleasure to meet you.
Okay, great. We're ready to go, right? So nice to have you all join us today. A quick introduction. My name is Yakir. I'm the head of mobility in our crowd in the business development department. And I would like to start maybe with a show of hands, asking you some kind of, how many of you used the following apps in the last month? So with a show of hands, which one of you used Uber or Lyft? Great, you can take them down. Which one of you used Bird, Lime, Spin, Jump, whatever? Something like that. Okay, Car2Go, anyone? Right, great. So it looks like we have kind of the right audience to speak to. Looking back, 2018 was a very interesting year. Starting with companies like Bird, the first company ever to reach the fastest company ever to reach $1 billion valuation. Ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft reaching tens of billions of dollars in valuation, and Uber basically very close to surpassing $100 billion in valuation. The only thing that seems to be on a decline is probably the rate of ownership. People are buying less and less cars. The trend is very clear. People are moving away from the traditional ownership model and moving more into other modes of transportation, whether it be ride-hailing, car-sharing, micro-mobility, and new modes of transportation, which we'll hear about in a second. Joining me today, so we have 5 experts on different modes of transportation that will help me in painting a picture of the future of multimodal transportation. So I'll read them, I'll introduce them by order of speakers. So the first one is Mike GRANOFF. Mike, the founder and managing partner of Maniv Mobility, an early stage mobility-focused startup, mobility-focused fund, sorry. The second, right after him, Tony Canestra, Director of Corporate Ventures at Denso, one of the largest Tier 1 suppliers around the world. After him, we will get John Cole on stage, the CEO of skyTran. skyTran, a portfolio company of our crowd, basically inventing and developing a new mode of transportation based on magnetic levitation pods. Paola Pisano, Deputy Mayor of the city of Turin, would give us the perspective of the government, of a government player, or sorry, a municipal player in incorporating all of these technologies and making them accessible to all of us as residents. As I call them to the podium one by one, I want you all maybe to try and kind of imagine, have some kind of a picture in your mind, maybe a map, zooming out one by one as we start from the micro-mobility sector with Mike GRANOFF and finish with the entire city view and even intercity connections. So I would like, with no further ado, calling the first speaker to stage. Mike, please.
Here kind of stole my thunder because I was going to get up here and ask how many people took a scooter here. But I am curious, one thing you didn't ask, how many people here came in their own personal car, or in a rental car, let's say? Okay, so that's interesting. It's some, but probably fewer than would have been the case a few years ago. And so I thought what I'd do, as Kira said, Maniv Mobility is a venture fund based here in Israel that invests in early stage technologies around mobility and what we see as really the digitization of transportation that's happening very, very in very large fashion here, as I'm sure you've already begun to appreciate, and globally as well. And we'll talk more about that. But what I thought I'd do is just try to put this in a larger context in terms of what I've coined these epochs of of mobility. So this would be like mobility 1.0. It still works. I don't know if people tried it, but walking is still a form of mobility, and one that I think maybe is underrated. But we had this form of mobility 1.0 for thousands of years before we then figured out that we could harness the power of animals to bring us even more efficient form of mobility. And then that lasted for many hundreds of years until I would say that you can categorize the next epoch in transportation very precisely to October 1st, 1908, which was the introduction of the Ford Model T, the first vehicle that was designed for mass adoption and succeeded brilliantly in that. In fact, to the point where this year in the US, they're celebrating the 100th anniversary of peak horse. Because it was in 1919, just a little over 10 years after the introduction of the Model T, that the U.S. horse population peaked and then began to decline dramatically. And we all know the reason why. It's because car ownership and individual owner-operator of individual cars with using internal combustion engines became the standard for transportation for, I would say, again, exactly 100 years. And the thing about Mobility 3.0 is, as my partner Olaf likes to say, the car really became like the decathlete. It did all these, people generally buy the car for the extreme use case that maybe they do once a year, but then the big vehicle that they bought to go up skiing once a year is also what they use to drive into the city to work every day. And that's kind of the world that we just came to accept and got used to and didn't have any necessary constraints until recently, when new opportunities and new limitations began to emerge. And really, I think you could say that if the 90s and the 2000s was about digitizing information and technology, that the period that we entered into, really exactly 100 years after the Model T, the financial crisis, the bankruptcy of several automakers, the surge in oil prices that then crashed the global economy and caused the financial crisis, that all of that coming in the very same year that the first apps for smartphones came about really represents this new era of mobility. And there's one other very important factor here that I'd like to highlight. And this is a slide from Horst Elu, who's really the godfather of this idea of micro-mobility. And if you can't see precisely, you can get the idea that what it demonstrates is how far are car trips generally. And you can see that they skew very, very largely towards the shorter distance trips. In fact, at about 5 miles, more than half of all car trips are below that range. And using the car for that, again, in this the decathlete analogy, maybe not the best use of a many thousands of pound vehicle that has crowds our streets and has issues with emissions and so forth. So what is 4 about? Well, first, as I talked about, you have this 100-year period of Mobility 3.0 being the vehicle, and then all of a sudden in 2008. This explosion of new opportunities that Yakir highlighted a bit in his introduction, from Waze, one of the first third-party cell phone apps, to the bankruptcies, and the Google hiring the DARPA Challenge winners to set up a self-driving car program in 2009, the founding of companies like Lyft and Via, Tesla's success in marketing a car that didn't use oil, and then ultimately some of these other things leading up to 2018, which, as Yakir mentioned, has been coined the year of the scooter. And I think the best way to understand the impulse for the scooter is that urbanization is a trend we're all familiar with, and urban transit systems, we all understand, have really been stretched to limits, and road space is not getting any larger as our populations in cities grow. And I personally gave up using my own car for commuting some time ago, and I commute by bus when it's convenient, otherwise by taxi, which I find is actually cheaper than car ownership, but it does have a problem that sometimes you're sitting in congestion in rush hour trying to get into Tel Aviv, in my case. And right alongside where I take these taxis often during rush hour is a bike lane. And about a year and a half ago, I first saw a mobike appear right outside my window in the bike lane, just sitting there. And I'd read about it, and I downloaded the app, and I hopped out of the cab and onto the mobike and was in my office a few minutes later. It was very exciting. And 6 months later, I saw a scooter. And I did exactly the same thing. And I realized this is the impulse that is driving this Mobility 4.0, which is, I'd say, characterized by diversification of vehicles, diversification of models, and increasingly connected, shared, ultimately automated, and also electric. So those are the themes that I think characterize the very exciting new age of transportation that we're entering into. Maniv, we're investing in underlying technologies that support all of these themes, and you can learn more about us at maniv.com. But I would say that next year when you come to this conference, maybe you'll have even more options on how to get there. Maybe even your flying car will be available. But the bottom line, I think, for the future of mobility is lots of choice, lots of diversification, and a lot of exciting things to come. And with that, who's up? Tony?
Yes. So thank you, Mike. And coming right up is Tony.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I will hopefully try to keep this coherent, although I spent a lot of time at the cannabis booth today. So, if it doesn't quite make sense, I got to blame it on that. I didn't bring any slides because I just like to sort of speak as a stream of thought if I can. But one quick question for everybody: who knows who Denso is? Well, more than I would have guessed. For those of you that don't, Denso is one of the world's largest auto parts suppliers. So we're what's commonly referred to as a tier one. So sitting right below the auto manufacturers is a company like Denso. Some of our competitors that you may know would be like a Bosch or a Continental or what used to be called Delphi. Now it's often referred to as Aptiv. So we've been in the car business or in the auto parts business since 1949. We actually spun out from Toyota Motors. And Toyota Motors is still our #1 customer worldwide. So we have a very large business around the world now. Last fiscal year, we did about $48 billion in revenue, about $4.2 billion in net profit. We have manufacturing operations around the world, along with sales and marketing facilities around the world as well. So about 6 years ago, we undertook an effort to try to understand how these changes that you see in the transportation industry would begin to impact us. And we really began at that time to embrace external innovation. Traditionally, I think as Mike pointed out very well in his history of the auto industry, R&D efforts in automotive were fairly relegated to internal efforts. So the OEM would tell us what they wanted to have done. We would have to try to innovate, working with our partners in the tier below us, and then try to deliver that technology to the OEM. So a lot of what you have now in your vehicle has gone through that particular route. I think a lot of what you'll see over the next 20 years in your vehicle will be a combination of internal and external innovation. So my title is the Director of Corporate Ventures. I do all of the direct investing for Denso into startup companies. Typically, we're an early stage investor, so seed to Series B is our sweet spot. We will lead investments because when we find a technology that we like to get going to work with that company very quickly. We do not invest for financial reasons, so it's really all about strategic relationships with a particular startup. We have 15 companies in our portfolio right now. We invest in transportation across 5 different sectors: autonomous driving, cybersecurity, connected vehicle, what we refer to as new mobility, and then finally electrification. So as we look forward into the industry of the future, we see a intersection of electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. And certainly the new mobility platforms that we see out there, whether it's the Ubers and Lyfts of the world or the e-scooters, the e-bike sharing companies, all of those will come to play in this future. And for us, it's really trying to understand how that mobility mix gets wired and gets connected, and how can we as a tier one play in that future. Certainly there are rumors that car ownership may be decreasing. We're a little bit worried about that future, obviously, because that's our core business right now. But we do believe that the tier ones will have a very important role to play, because the automobiles that will be made will have lots of parts and systems and modules that will be created by us and be supplied to potentially lots of new OEMs that are cropping up around the world. But this idea of connected this new mobility platform is really a challenge for us to try to understand. It's one of the reasons why we like to attend these kind of conferences and see what's going on in a tech hub such as Israel. The idea that you can be able to open an app and be connected to all sorts of different mobility options, as well as have those options sort of be able to cross-talk to each other, so that at any period in a day, let's say you're going out to a late lunch, and you're going to meet a friend at 12:45 p.m. As you're walking out of the office at 12:20, you want to be able to see exactly what your options are across all the different mobility providers to get to meet your friend at 12:45. That connection is slowly beginning to happen. Hopefully we'll get a chance to hear from the Deputy Mayor about how you can connect some city services and things that are already running like buses into that ecosystem. But that's an area where we're very keenly interested to play. Denso, in our new mobility group, has made 2 different investments in this area. One of them is a company called ActiveScaler that is working to do advanced fleet management to bring in different kinds of fleets and manage how they're exposed through a GUI, like an app, to the general public, and how the general public could then use those in a multimodal role, basically to essentially buy one trip. And that trip may eventually involve different kinds of transportation to get where you want to go, but you'll have complete visibility to all the different modes, public and private, in order to get there. The other company is a company out of Finland called magLev, MAS standing for Mobility as a Service. Again, they're trying to work within Europe to deliver the connection between public and private transportation to, again, give you that visibility to purchase a single ticket to do a multimodal trip. So those areas are of interest to us. I think what also is important for everyone in the audience to understand is there's different layers to this problem. And one layer that we take very seriously is the issue of cybersecurity. So as we open up more and more of these opportunities for multimodal transportation to you, we got to make sure that those connections are secure. We need to make sure that you're traveling in a safe environment, whether it's in a vehicle that has parts that we have provided in there, or whether you're going from an e-bike to a taxi to a bus to get to your final destination. So cybersecurity is an underlying factor that I think is not being ignored, but to a certain extent is something that we worry about industry-wide, because as we start making more and more connections, there's more and more potential vulnerabilities and openings for bad actors to get in and to wreak a bit of havoc on the system as well as on your trip, hopefully not on your physical security. So those are all things that we take into consideration. Certainly happy later on in the session as the 1 minute lady walks by me here. And there she goes. So I'm going to save us a minute of time by wrapping up now, but hopefully that'll leave us a minute to answer some questions that you have after we get done with the rest of the presentations. Thank you very much.
Next up is John Cole. As I said before, John is the CEO of skyTran, developing a new mode of transportation, and I'll let John expand on that. Yes.
And then this works, right? Okay, great. All right, thank you very much. I'm John Cole, CEO of skyTran, and as I go through this presentation, take a look at this image here. This is what it looks like. It's a magnetic levitation vehicle that flies on an overhead guideway. So the skyTran is dedicated to solving the #1 local problem on the planet, urban traffic congestion, which cities today are broken. They just don't function anymore because they've scaled beyond their antiquated 19th and 20th century infrastructures. So let's look at what the standard solution is, public transit. This could be a bus, could be a train, trolley, but they all have the same architecture. Basically what you're asking people to do is a whole lot of things they don't want to do. Multimodal transit to a concentrated place where you have to wait. Get on a vehicle with a bunch of strangers, stop at a series of stops that you don't want to go to, end up someplace not near where you want to go, and then another mode of transit to where you want to go. This is incompatible with how we live today, and this is why public transit adoption has dropped substantially in the last decade. So public transit is not an option. Autonomous vehicles are not an option because they're fundamentally just improvements to a car that are stuck on a saturated infrastructure. So let's really look at what we need to do. We need to look at a substitute for cars. Cars are successful, so let's emulate the car. What do we need? We need to go long distances. That means we need speed. We need to be able to pick up people very close to where they are and take them very close to where they're going. That means we need networks. We need a lot of capacity. That means we need automation for tight headways. We need privacy because that's what people expect in cars. And finally, we need to be able to do this at the scale we need to. There isn't enough government money. It needs to be inexpensive enough to be funded through private financing mechanisms. So what do we need? We need a low-cost, high-speed network to carry small automated packets. This is what SkyTran is. It's the combination of a personal rapid transit architecture with a suite of new magnetic levitation technologies that gives you what the market needs, a physical packet switching network. And so what SkyTran is an infrastructure that has a lot of things built onto it. It carries telecom, power, logistics, but I'm just talking now about the packet switching layer. So what SkyTran is first and foremost on the architecture side is it starts off as a line, but through market forces gets pulled into a network. Instead of having these concentrated stations, you have a cloud of small stations around the city, just a few minute walk away, which means that you can go from anywhere to anywhere, seamlessly moving through a network without stopping. Secondly, SkyTran, the stations are parallel. You don't, not like a bus or a train where you stop in the middle of the road. You switch off, and then traffic continues unimpeded. So, and it's elevated everywhere. No traffic is blocked for ground traffic. And thirdly, the system is so small, because they're individual vehicles, they're so small they can fit inside buildings and over sidewalks. They can be retrofitted inside modern cities. So 30, 20 years from now, we'll look back and say, well, back in the old days, they didn't have transportation built into buildings like they do now. All right, on top of that, there's a suite of 4 fundamental technologies: a new type of magnetic levitation, an entirely new type of propulsion, a way to switch vehicles from one guideway to another, and a very sophisticated control system. You put all this together, you take the architecture and the technology together, and you get the solution you need. And the critical thing is we need the capacity of public transit. This is accomplished through automation and magnetic levitation. We're able to compress the headways, the time between vehicles. We're able to compress that down so that one guideway that's about 1.5 meters wide carries as much traffic as a 3-lane freeway. Now, the business model leverages the most successful business model we have out there today, which is mobility as a service. There's two reasons why Uber and Lyft and companies like that have such incredible valuations. Public transit is declining, public transit adoption is declining, and car ownership is declining. So what are they doing? They're taking Uber and Lyft and similar opportunities. But at the end of the day, they're still stuck on roads with cars, so they're limited. SkyTran leverages this same business model all the way from the last mile, not out to 30 kilometers, but out to 1,000 kilometers. Because of its tremendous speed, under 1,000 kilometers, it's faster than flying. Now, just that little part there on the left where it shows those existing mobility as a service solutions, that's $3 trillion by 2030. Imagine what the value of that entire market is, since you're taking market share away from regional airlines, public transit, Uber and Lyft. Where we will start is small corridors, 10 to 30, 40, 50 kilometer corridors outside of cities. SkyTran is real. We have an actual full-scale test track that has demonstrated the basics of the propulsion, the switching, the levitation, and all the control. It's actually been built. This is actually right here in Israel. This is at the Israel Aerospace Industries campus at Ben Gurion Airport. SkyTran is being manufactured. We're actually going to build our first production guideway this summer, and the components are being manufactured right now. So what you see here is a 12.5 meter subsection of guideway that's going to be assembled into a 25-meter span. And you can see the aluminum elements being put into it. So by this summer, we will have an actual vehicle flying in an actual guideway, non-human rated. By the summer of 2020, we will have a human-rated vehicle flying inside of a guideway. Now, SkyTran is gotten a lot of funding. We've gotten about, over the last couple of years, our backers are a mix of family offices, venture capital, and corporates. The main private office backers are Eric Schmidt of Google, Adam Newman of WeWork, and Tim Draper, and our corporates are Reliance and IAI. So the company has very good backers and good funding, and the company's going forward with a Series B later this year, which our crowd is participating in. So that's about it.
Okay, so thank you, John. Next up, are we ready with the next slide? Okay. So next up on stage is Paola Pisano, Deputy Mayor of the city of Turin. And I'll let her speak about a bit about how the city incorporates everything that we heard about now, up until now, with all the modes and different ways to move around the city.
Not me, the city.
No, not
Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much to our crowd to host our city in this beautiful place, in your beautiful city. Today, we would like to introduce our city, our strategy around mobility, and how we apply our strategy on the project on smart mobility and autonomous mobility. So for whom doesn't know my city, this is Torino. Torino is in the north of Italy. You can see that in that point. We have more or less 800,000 of citizens, 2 public universities, 300 startups, and 70,000 SME and big company. So we apply in our city to attract innovation, 2 types of strategies. The first strategy I call the impatient strategy, and the second one is the patient strategy. So these 2 strategies, we combine these 2 strategies to different projects, and we combine this strategy also for the mobility project. So let me briefly introduce you this kind of strategy. The impatient strategy is a strategy that the Torino is doing with 8 main partners. One of these partners is Intesa San Paolo, the Innovation Center, that I thank also for inviting us in this beautiful event and to host us. And what we are doing with this strategy, we want to attract innovation in our city. So the trick is this. If you are an organization and you need to test innovation in a real environment, and your innovation is at the pre-commercial state, come to Torino. We can give you all our city to test your innovation and to demonstrate the validity of your innovation. We will support you with data, with infrastructure, with authorization if you need authorization, simplifying the procedure. Also in Italy is possible sometimes. And then you start the testing. Then, if your testing will go good, we will support you in scaling up in our nation and at international level. So, why we are doing this? We are doing this to attract in our city innovation, to give new opportunity for our citizens, and to create an ecosystem that is open and ready for the innovation and for the new startup. And this is the fast strategy, the impatient strategy that we are creating. The patient strategy is the strategy that is focused around the high level of knowledge-intensive district that we are creating in our city. So it's a strategy that needs more time, that needs to reinforce the link between our organization, between our company, in order to create a more strong ecosystem around the important industry in our city. Think about the aerospace industry, think about the car and the mobility industry, the manufacturing industry, but also the telecommunication industry that is really strong in our city, and the robotic industry. And as everybody tell me that I always speak about the technological innovation, we are also supporting the social innovation and the ecosystem of social innovation. So this is the step of our project around smart mobility. We start in March 2018 with a decree of the national decree that gives the opportunity to the city to test autonomous car inside the city. So we start from that point, and we start in April to create the partnership. So to use the patient strategy in order to create the ecosystem around autonomous car. You can see all our partners around this project. We have automotive partner, we have telecommunication partner, we have university and research center that are all together in order to create innovation inside the autonomous industry. Then we define an urban circuit, a circuit where we can test innovative mobility. So we put in this circuit 35 kilometers of circuit inside our city, all the technology that is useful to sustain the autonomous car. So 5G technology, intelligent smart lighter, cloud computing close to the network in order to create the interaction between the vehicle and the infrastructure. Then we start with our fast strategy, and we define the use case that we would like to test in our city. Use case relating the relationship between the vehicle and the infrastructure, but also all the services that we can develop with the data that autonomous car produce. So services to give new information to the driver and maybe support also a new behavior of our Italian driver that are really aggressive in the street. And also create a mobility as a service, so collect all the data of mobility in order to give the opportunity to the citizen to move with different type of mobility in our city. And then we start with the testing in our city of new kind of mobility. Here you can see the measure of Torino, Chiara Appendino and me with a testing of a new autonomous van in our city, Navia. This is the fast strategy. We attract a partner in our city and we start the testing of their mobility in order to demonstrate the validity of this van and then to start the scale up of this innovation. We test remote control car, we test autonomous car in our city, and at the end, in this year, we start with the service, because the testing for us is useful, of course, to link the test to the service that we want to bring in our city. And so, thank again to the Innovation Center in Intesa San Paolo and the Italian ambassador. We was able to create a link between Torino and Mobileye. And so we attract Mobileye in our city, and they will develop a precision mapping in our city in order to support the new ecosystem and the startup that would like to come in our city and use this data to test autonomous car and new type of mobility. And of course, we start to use Navia to give the public transportation. Finally, if I have 5 seconds more, I would like to announce today the partnership between the city of Torino and our crowd. So for us, this is a very important partnership because it can give the opportunity to the startup of our crowd to come in our city and test their innovation. And, thank you. And also give the opportunity to our organization and our startup to be in such an important platform like our crowd is. So finally, we don't want to be the best city, but we want to be the first city for innovation. So thank you very much.
So thank you for that, Paola. And last but not least, which I might have missed in my first introduction, is Storm Duncan. Storm, head of global mobility and M&A in Jefferies, also co-hosting this event. Storm will give us an overview of what are some of the obstacles that we might encounter trying to get into the future of mobility. So Storm, please take it from here.
Thank you. You're such a good man and human. He's been so wonderful to me during this trip. I'm going to try to go through this efficiently, so I might talk a little quickly, and I apologize for that at the end. If you have any questions, I'll be around. I think one of the things we all know is that this is a massive, massive market that we're addressing. There's a little controversy as to whether it's a $7 trillion market or a $10 trillion market, so I'll just assume it's $7 trillion and say that it's a massive market opportunity that has been very, very underpenetrated. If you look at whether it's the delivery of food or the delivery of humans, a fraction of that market has been attacked by the new mobility ecosystem out there. The thing that's most important to me, and Denzo might have a problem with me saying this, but I'll go ahead and say it, is the whole ecosystem as it exists today has fundamentally become in jeopardy of the new mobility ecosystem. So if you look at this, every single aspect of what's happening today, ownership, the sale and purchase of vehicles, human-driven, single-modal, fossil fuel, and analog, is being transitioned to the sharing market, the subscription market, autonomous, multimodal, multi-use electric and connected cars. So the point of that is every single thing that exists today, every single company that exists today in this market is in jeopardy of disappearing. So every company has to either adapt or be replaced by all of the new companies that are existing out there today. The problem is that humans view things differently than how they work currently today. With respect to today, and I think a couple of the panelists have talked about that, the problem isn't that I have to have a car or I have to have a bus or a bicycle. The problem is I am here and I need to be there. And the question is what's the most efficient or cost-effective way to get there, or the most convenient way to get there? So whether you're at work and you need to be at a client meeting and you historically have taken a car or a bus there, now the question is there another option that's much more efficient or effective from a cost perspective? And that's true for food and packages as well. You don't just create efficiencies by moving humans in a more efficient way, or moving humans in an efficient way, but also by moving food and packages in a more efficient way, because a lot of the congestion is not just about human, I don't want to say trafficking, but moving humans from one place to another. Get myself into trouble here. So the drivers of success going forward in this market are understanding how humans and packages and foods need to move. And there's decision factors along that path of how you move things from one place to another. So the question is what are those factors? Price. Different people have different economics of how they live their life. And so they need to have different modalities of getting there in a more cost-effective way, or for the wealthy in a more convenient way, a faster way. So speed is a second aspect of that, and the experience you have during that movement from one place to another. So as an example, a very wealthy person might want to be in a vehicle where they're getting a massage or they have more room to do work, whereas if you're working at a coffee shop, the price is much more important, even if it takes longer to get there. And then the convenience aspect of it is having one application on your phone that allows you to seamlessly transition between all of these different opportunities automatically, even if you're economically in one class, and so therefore you're typically in one modem, but you're late for work, so you have to choose the other or the other way around. The interesting thing about this market now is what it is from an ecosystem perspective. The way this market works is for you to address all these things of cost, time, convenience, experience, is you need to have more liquidity in your network. You need to have more vehicles, what we call the supply side, more bicycles, etc. And on the other side, you need to have the most amount of people using your system. So the more people that use your ecosystem or your application and your forms of transit, the more things you can afford to put on that ecosystem in transit, not just from the network effect and the supply effect of vehicles, but more conveniences that go into those. So a little bit of controversy here. I don't think we're at peak car and we're at peak car declining. I think it's going to continue to expand because cars are going to have more functionality, and I think you're going to see other things start to disappear. Restaurants, micro apartments, hotels, because the cars will have the functionality to begin to replace these things. And you see this all the way around. When I first started in this industry, because of my belief that I just said, that the more liquidity you have, the more successful you can be, that's what's known in the technology world as a network effects business. That's a digital network effects business, and I view this as an analog effects business. So the more liquidity you have, the more capability you have of being cheaper for your consumers, faster for your consumers, and providing more experience. What I've learned over time is that it is actually a natural duopoly market. And the reason for that, so as one person exits a market and you create a monopoly like Uber did in China, like Uber did in Southeast Asia, and a lot of these other things, there's some rumors about some other acquisitions Uber's about to make, a second partner or competitor moves into that market. So why in a natural monopolistic world would that happen? Because it's a $7 to $10 trillion market. So there's always going to be a second form of liquidity in that market. And the other aspect of these natural monopolies, or natural duopolies as I would say, is by having multiple forms of modalities, which you've heard about from some of the panelists, it allows you to do a couple different things. It allows you to have different distances for transit. So if you're going for a mile up to thousands of miles, you can choose the appropriate form of transit that is either most economical, most convenient, or fast along that spectrum. So it allows you, if you're going for 1 mile, to not take your vehicle anymore, to take an electric bike or a scooter to get there more cost effectively and quicker. And then likewise, up the spectrum, you have more distance capabilities from a different economic perspective. And then on the other axis, because of the different costs of these, it allows you to attack the entire economic spectrum of society. It allows you to attack the wealthy from a more convenient perspective, a faster perspective, and then you can go all the way down the stratum to bring in people into the transportation network in much faster ways that didn't have access to some of these modalities before. The other interesting aspect of this that people haven't really thought about yet is the protected nature of these industries. So currently we see a lot of companies operating around the world. So Uber's in multiple geographies, a lot of these other companies like Southeast Asia are in multiple geographies. But I think what we're going to learn over time is this is going to become a national security issue. The concept of the United States letting a Chinese company in, for example, to the United States and running a third of the transportation infrastructure is just not an option. You don't want to have a problem with them from a political perspective, a war perspective, an economic perspective, and have them push a button and turn off a third of your transportation infrastructure. So this duopolistic market that is attacking a very massive economic opportunity is going to be protected. So these two companies that exist in each market are going to have a lot of opportunity for themselves. And there's a big transition going on. Again, Denzo might not like this slide as well, so apologies to a very great partner of ours, by the way. The existing infrastructure ecosystem right now is that you have this entire group of OEMs supported by a little bit of infrastructure underneath them that allows them to build cars very efficiently. And they sell a vehicle to a customer. And then that customer has developed relationships after they own that with the OEM, with all the suppliers underneath, fuel companies, service companies, tire companies, etc. In the new paradigm, what you have is the relationship with the customer is transitioning from this method to an intermediary or a transportation as a service company who will then manage that entire infrastructure underneath the ecosystem. I call this first revenue. And the reason that's so powerful, one other point I would make, so that one person, that one intermediary is going to control the whole infrastructure that exists underneath it. So they're going to control the OEM and therefore all the suppliers to the OEM. They're going to demand better cars for the new type of transportation. They're going to demand lower costs. They're going to probably try to steal some of the margin from them. And they're going to control the entire other part of the ecosystem. They will wash the cars. They will fuel them. They will make sure that they are serviced. So this big transition means that these two companies that are in each geography that are protected probably by their governments are going to eat almost all of that entire $7 to $10 trillion. So when we see those companies going public, I'm in the process of taking Lyft public, we announced this week. When you see these two companies go public and you see these questions or concerns about what is their limit to growth, I think they have a massive opportunity available to them. I hope I didn't violate any securities laws by saying that. And for the consumer, they're going to have one application that manages this for all of them. They might have two of these applications on the phone because there's two services. My suspicion is that loyalty will increasingly go to one company or the other for each individual consumer, and they will have on that one application the ability to choose seamlessly between what they want at that moment going from one place to another place. Am I looking for speed today? Am I looking for a good experience because I'm going to the concert on a date? Am I looking for the cheapest mode of operation because I have time to get there and I don't want to use my pocketbook to overpay for that? So the one thing that's potentially jeopardizes these companies and the future of transportation and the power of these two companies is if a network layer gets put above these two companies. And what I mean by that is currently these companies have a relationship with the consumer, and the reason they're able to maintain that leadership is not just because of protectionism, but because of what I said earlier, which is there's a tremendous amount of liquidity around their system. The one thing that puts them in jeopardy is if there's a layer put above this system that allows someone else to aggregate that liquidity. So this is similar to what Google Maps, as an example, is doing right now. You take Google Maps and then you do a partnership with Lyft, you do a partnership with Uber, you do a partnership with Lime, you do a partnership with Bird, and all of a sudden you have everybody's liquidity on your system. And you add liquidity to that system, which is why those companies are partnering with them. It's more customers, more opportunity for revenue. And so then you can aggregate that liquidity and in essence do exactly, oh, she's saying I have 15 more minutes. Thank you, I appreciate that. You can aggregate that and have tremendous amount of liquidity on one system. So I do think these companies do have potential aspects of their business that are in jeopardy. And another aspect, I put Waymo and Cruise at the bottom, is if you have autonomous vehicles, which I think is very, very far out, so it's not something for us all to worry about right now from a displacement perspective, as opposed to a technology perspective. These companies, by virtue of having digital capabilities, can create a network through these digital capabilities of having an application layer built right into them. So what you're going to see as a second form of risk to them is if you have two companies, if I'm wrong about the other companies aggregating above them, you're going to see transportation move from a service to a utility that will be heavily regulated by the government. With two players out there, you have no option as a government but to regulate them as a utility. And the most important slide in this entire deck, in my mind, is that if you are in the market to change the future of transportation, to make humanity better, and you're in Israel, Nadi Ganor runs our Israeli office, so please keep that name in mind. We love him. He's helping you change the world.
So thank you, Storm, for that lovely insight, these lovely insights into the future of mobility, sorry. I would like to, maybe if we have a bit of time, take a few questions from the audience. You can address them directly to our to the panelists. Yeah, so go ahead.
I think the pattern, it's been lots of innovation at the sort of seed stage. We see 50, 60 companies every month with ideas like that and many others. But then ultimately, as Storm was alluding to, the ones that succeed end up getting aggregated. Typically happens, and I think that's a pattern that we'll probably see repeat in several aspects of mobility over the next decade.
Yeah, I think that you will definitely see niche players try to carve out a piece of profitability for themselves. You mentioned Zoom. Well, that's actually a Series C round, right? So it's been around for a while. It's not a new idea. But I think there is room to find new areas of, I don't want to call it modality, but new areas of service offerings that maybe haven't been completely fleshed out, and you can maybe generate some profitability in that model. But yeah, you're more than likely then to be acquired. I think it's going to be hard to find the big space. I think those have already been captured.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, please.
I've noticed that most of the innovation is happening in urban centers, obviously, because of the transportation issues. I don't see much innovation happening in rural. What's happening in the rural world? Israel is a very spread out, not very spread out, but there are a lot of rural communities in Israel.
Relatively.
And there's a real issue in terms of rural transportation. like to hear the panel address what they expect to be happening in that area.
Thank you for the great question. Rural is going to be a little bit delayed in catching up to the city, and even different large cities have different capabilities of having forms of modalities. So if you go over to China, you'll discover, as an example, that bicycles have not worked that well because these cities are massive and spread out. So the bicycle opportunities over there have not really worked that well, and they don't think they're going to work that well. So even big cities have problems. The problem that the rural cities have is that the economics of transportation as it currently exists are very, very difficult. So if you think about how the modality works now for an automobile, if you have an automobile and it costs $30,000 and that automobile, let's just say in a utility like a Lyft, lasts 3 years because of the high mileage usage of it, that means you're basically taking a vehicle that's used 4% of the time, but for simplicity I'm going to say 0% of the time, and now you're using it about 86% of the time, but let's assume for simplicity it's 100% of the time. So you're basically taking and creating $30,000 of value. But what you're doing then is putting a driver in that car over that 3-year period that is earning more than $10,000 per year. So this is a very uneconomic proposition, and that's why all these businesses are subsidizing currently their models. That doesn't work in small cities. So until Denso facilitates the creation of autonomous vehicles for their OEMs, the cost and economics of moving into a smaller city are just very, very challenging. The way they will make it work is they'll start to create synergies between the movement of packages, food, and people to reduce the economics, and they'll start to put more people in a car, but even that's challenging in a small city because people are not necessarily going to the same place like they are in a big city.
Okay, and I think we have time for one last question. So let's take from that area maybe of the crowd. Yes, right there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was speaking to, I'm sorry, what was your name? I forgot your name. Why Torino? Why did that city decide, like, how did you come up and say, we're going to do this in this city now?
Why not?
But I meant like by size.
No, I have an answer. So in our city, why Torino for the mobility? Okay. So we have a lot of SME that are working around mobility. In our city, born FCA, Fiat. So for this reason, we are the city of car. So this is maybe the point that we have a strong ecosystem around mobility and around manufacturing. So for this reason, for us, it's natural to do this evolution.
Okay, and I think with that, I would like to end because we're running out of time. So I would like to thank all of our speakers. Thank you for sharing all the insights. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit. Yes, please, thank you.